at here is a Volkswagen 020 transaxle. This particular one came out of my 89 Cabby. We're going to put in a shim kit today, and as you'll see once we get going, it actually preloads this flange, and that keeps it from slipping and rotating independently of the other side. So if we would lose traction on this side of the transmission, instead of this just spinning like crazy, the preload that the shim kit puts in will actually keep that from happening and allow you partial drive to the other side, to the other hub, and pretty much operates like a limited slip. We're putting in the Peloquin 20% shim today, and I've heard a lot of good things about it. It's awesome if you're autocrossing. A full limited slip or a Peloquin torque bias system would be even more awesome, but I don't have $800 sitting around right now, and this cost about $80 a side, I think, so I decided to go with this. So as you can see, we've got plenty of grease down in here, and we're going to need to dig some of that out of there before we can even get down to the parts that we need. So bear with me while we clean up. This piece down here, see if we can focus in on that just a little bit better. Okay, that's a cap that goes over all the stuff down below it, so we're going to have to pry that off. And notice that it's got a deformable top. It's actually coated in rubber. And this is so when your axles flex back and forth, and let me widen back up on this. When your axle flexes and goes back and forth, occasionally it'll hit this. I've pulled some of these off where it's hit it enough because the engine was maybe not centered properly. It actually will wear a hole in the middle of this. It's not altogether a bad thing, but it just shows that you're out of alignment. So this is kind of a buffer, or a bumper I should say, to keep that from happening. Now what we have down in here is a lock ring. I'm going to clean this up well enough that hopefully you can see it. Okay, now this is the cap that's down in there. You see it's deformable. Prying it out with a screwdriver. Bent the lip of that. And we'll bend that back to put it back in if I don't have a spare. Here are the parts. We're going to have a seal that goes underneath this into the transaxle. This is part of the shims that will be used. We'll see how these go in. This is a lock ring. If you look down in here, you can see that lock ring. That's what's actually holding all this together right now. I have reused the lock rings. It's not recommended. And there we go. These are always tricky, but they eventually come out. So I've got a selection of lock ring removers. Mostly because no one of them works well. The combination of them seems to get the job done. Okay, while you weren't looking, I cleaned up the inside of this a little bit. That's the moisture that you see there. So don't freak out about the appearance of liquid. That's just carb cleaner. In this case, flange cleaner. This can be done with the transmission in the car attached to the engine. I should probably mention that. I've obviously got mine sitting on the bench here. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier. We'll find out. All attempts to try and remove the flange have proved fruitless. So we're using a 3-jaw puller to gently walk it out. So at this point, I have to remind everybody that let's not forget this has been together for 30 years and probably never taken apart. Well, as you can see, we finally got the flange loose. Now, I'm going to tell you, I used a bearing puller and it was still a pain in the butt, but it did come up. I did a lot of research of a lot of YouTube videos where some people just simply took the circlips up and lifted the piece out, and boy, was that wishful thinking on my part. It took the bearing puller to get it loose. It finally pulls out. There's just splines holding it in there, but like I say, this thing has been bashed up and down and back and forth after 30 years of driving, that the two spline bodies have basically seized together. Once you get them apart and clean them up, they're fine. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to put a new seal in, fortunately. But as you can see, the wear, and we've gotten some water in here, so we formed a little bit of rust. That's not good. There's a spring with this cap on it. Now, the spring actually does not need to be there. The spring was added a long time ago by Volkswagen, because without this spring, if this was sliding up and down as it should on that spline, you're going to get shatter. Every time you accelerate, decelerate, every time you turn, and the hub goes in and out and in and out. So some people bitched about that. VW listened and said, okay, we'll preload this with this spring to keep that from happening. So that's why that spring's there. It's really heavy duty spring. I mean, ideally, just that spring in there should have popped this loose when I got the bolt out, but it didn't. So let that be a lesson to all of us. So I'm going to set this aside for cleaning. And let's see if we can get a better look down inside there and see what awaits us. Now, obviously, we have this seal. That's got to come out and be replaced with a new one. That's pretty much your usual sort of stuff. Now, if you can see the brass color that's down in here, that's a separate ring. We're going to be replacing that with a brand new one. It is not uncommon. See this ring? It's actually got a groove in it, cut all the way through. Let me see if I can, there you go. And that's so it can compress. Now sometimes you'll pull these out and you'll find that they're broken into several pieces. Well, obviously that's not right. Pull them out. We've got replacements here, so no problem. This one looks to be in good shape. Yeah, you can see the slanted cut. That's the part in there that allows it to compress. Now, I'm not sure the best way to actually remove that, so I'm going to have to play with it a little bit. It's not magnetic, so I'm most certainly not going to get it out with a magnet. Well, look at that. I compressed it a little bit. Ooh. Now, I don't think these can fall into the transmission, but you know, why take any chances? I don't know whether you can tell or not, but these have a taper to them as well. So it's going to be important to get that taper facing down. Yep, that's the last piece of that. Alright, I've popped the main seal out. That was there. It's a little worse for the wear. It was still working, it wasn't leaking. But I've got a new seal to put in. I'll kind of keep some light in there so you can see the splining quite easily. There's the groove at the top of this piece where the circlip went. Down inside, in here, is where the brass piece went. And that's the last thing to pull out of there. As we remember, it was broken. Very common, not to be concerned about it. Below that, you can see the bearing. We're not going to replace the bearing at this point. We'd pretty much have to split the case and take that apart in order to get that hammered out of there. And it's running fine. I've got no play here at all, so I'm not going to worry myself about that. Okay, I hope you've had a good look in there. We're going to put the brass piece in. Now it's tapered, remember? There we go. It's tapered and the tapered part of it goes down. Remember, it's split, so it will compress. Okay, I've got it down in there. Being suggested to get that to seat all the way down there as we take the spring cup from the flange. That's this piece that was on the spring. Place that down on there, then tap away at that to seat it. So let's give that a shot. We've got the brass cone in there. Next thing we're going to do is take the spring seat and put our new thrust washer in there. This is what forces the spring to be of higher tension. And we'll just drop that in on top of that. And then we'll take the big old spring and we'll put it over that. Next thing we'll do is we're going to clean this up. And we'll put that back in where it belongs. Give that about a half an hour. We'll get back to it and clean it up. As you can see, we've got our new seal in, and we've cleaned up the hub, given it a little bit of paint to match the transmission. Seat the spring on there, and then we've got the spring cup to go on, but don't forget, we've also got the thrust washer to put in here. This is going to preload from the back side on this spring. Now if all we did was put that one washer in there, that would give us 40% loading for the limited slip version of all this. Now remember, this didn't want to come off, so it's not wanting to go back on. So we're going to use the back end of the hammer just to pound this down onto the splines, and it's going down on there. Just being a little persnickety. I'm going to try and turn this sideways. Which isn't working out too well. Okay. If you can see this space here, this should be pushed almost all the way in on that. Obviously, we've got a ways to go. Now, in order to get the rest of the distance pulled up, we have to at least get it up to the point where we can get the circlip around the splines. And we got about a 1/4 inch to go, I think. So we're going to use the tool that was supplied. As I tighten down this nut, that'll push this down onto the splines. There we go. Let's not forget we need this concave washer. It needs to go down in there, so we've got to have room for that. If anybody's wondering why I don't put an impact wrench on this, I can tell you why. I like to make my mistakes slowly, not in a hurry. Now with that in there, is there room to put the circlip? I believe there is. Okay, now with the one thrust washer that was put in there on the other side of the spring, that gives me 40% lockup. If I install this piece down on there and lock it on, that gives me basically 80%. So this piece has an O-ring that goes on. There you see it. Put that there. Get out our new circlip. I have to go ahead and install that. And let's see what I've got in the way of tools to do that properly. As hard as these things are to get off, they're even harder to put on. Since we're installing the 80% lockup, we're not going to reinstall this concave washer on the outside. We're just going to put the circlip on. And that's because after we do that, we're going to install this cap and the O-ring that goes on it. So it will fit down in here nicely and give us an additional layer of tension. Well, as you can see, we finally got the circlip in. It took a lot more fussing than I would have liked, but it's finally done and it's in there and secure. Now normally we would have been putting in the little black rubber coated cap, but in this case we're putting in the 80% disc. Notice, I think I showed you this before, but it has a rubber O-ring that comes with it. That's to seal the oil from coming out. We're going to install that instead of the rubber puck. That piece goes on there, seats down inside. We have this Allen-headed bolt that we're going to put in. And screw that down nice and tight to approximately 34 foot-pounds. So, well, as you can see, we managed to finish up installing the flanges. Second side went a little bit easier. Still had to use the bearing puller, just a standard 3-jaw puller, but it didn't take as much force in order to remove it this time. Changing the seal out was had to get a seal removal tool instead of just using a screwdriver. Made it a little easier. Otherwise, everything went right back together, and this baby is tight. Trying to turn one side versus the other, you just can't do it by hand. In fact, I think it takes 80 foot-pounds or more of difference in torque in order to manage to break that loose. Is this a perfect limited slip? No. However, if you get into a mud puddle and your inside wheel all of a sudden wants to spin, the outside one is still going to continue to have torque applied to it. And that's what really matters. It's not a perfect limited slip, but it's definitely going to make a difference when you're out autocrossing or just driving hard on the actual street. Driving in snow is going to be interesting. We'll have to figure that out, but it's the middle of July in Indiana, and even being Indiana, we probably won't have snow. Of course, it is 2020, so who knows what's next. Fairly easy job to do. Things lined up just fine. Literally the worst part was getting the hubs off and getting them back on. There's a circlip that has to get removed. That's not that big a deal. Putting it back on is. And I had to use some special circlip pliers in order to expand it enough to get it to go over the splines and seat in. Seriously, that was the worst of it. I was working out here in 90-degree heat, 90% humidity, and still wasn't that big a deal. So I'm glad I got this done. Transmission goes in next week. So I hope you like this. Hope you give it a consideration about putting this in your own 020, and it'll be well worth it, I'm sure. Feel free to subscribe. I believe the button's over there. And like this video if you did like it. And we've got a lot more stuff coming up. CIS is next. I know you've all been waiting to hear that. And that's going to start a series of, oh God, 10 or 20 videos. So hang on for that ride, but it'll be fun and informative. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Warren Sands. This is This Old Motor. See you next time.